Hello and welcome to the Warhammer Podcast, episode 68. I'm your host, Brad. This is my co-host, Eric.
How's it going?
And we're here with brand new equipment to screw up everything in whole new ways.
Yeah, I think it's going to be better than last week as you were trying to kludge together part of our new equipment.
I don't know if our audience is aware of how bad last week naturally sounded.
Yeah.
It got saved so well in editing that, when I listened to the final cut, I'm like, this sounds pretty normal. But it was a disaster on the back end. You have no idea how screwed it was.
Yeah, so I think this will be good. I mean, there may be slight tweaks here and there that we can kind of make it a little bit better, but hopefully this is a good new baseline.
Yeah, so don't be afraid to give us feedback if anything sounds weirdly different. We've got to figure things out on how to use all of our new equipment we're using. In addition, you're going to have to give feedback on this episode too, because I don't know what I'm doing. This is a type of episode I wanted to do for a long time now. We're going to cover collecting an army. Specifically in this episode, we are doing collecting Drukhari. I haven't quite figured out the structure for this episode, so we're going to figure it out as we go.
Sounds good. I think one of the best ways to kind of frame this discussion is going to be more of a story of how you did collecting it with some caveats of things learned, as opposed to trying to make it ubiquitous catch-all kind of thing.
Yeah, we'll start off with some of the generic, like why should you collect this army or why should you not?
Okay.
And then let's go through my journey collecting it and have a story time.
Yeah.
There is a lot of subjects for general army collection that will be throughout this. Like, I did 3D printing, I did kit bashing. There was all sorts of stuff that I learned throughout this that I would use on Thousand Sons, which I did after this army. And
right.
So there's a lot of things to learn in general from episodes like this, but it's also just fun to see someone's army and how they built it.
Yeah, and I think that there's a decent amount of people that haven't really gotten fully into Warhammer yet, and this is kind of like, I think it'll be interesting to hear your journey on this army for them as here's some expectation of what's ahead. But since we're talking specifically on Drukhari this time, you're collecting of it, what's your elevator sales pitch for collecting Drukhari?
Drukhari's an easy one to do a sales pitch for. You're the bad guys. You're not trying to woe is me, maybe I'm guilty about being a war criminal like a space wolf. Nothing of the sort. You know you're the bad guys. You literally just raid planets to take people back and torture them or use them as fodder in your coliseums. You don't care. You are the chaotic evil faction.
Yeah, there's no propaganda that's trying to paint it anything else.
There's some interesting tragedy to them and irony of they are the original Eldari who did not splinter off. The Exodites and the Craft Worlds both splintered off when things were getting too hedonistic in the major Eldar
Society, thank you.
My brain was like, don't say faction, you dipshit. When things were getting too hedonistic in the society.
Yeah.
And what was left was what would become the Drukhari. And 90% of that civilization died at the birth of Slaanesh.
Right.
The only ones who lived were the ones who were so depraved, they were in an eternal, horrifying orgy thing in the webway. This is where Kamara is. That's who the Drukhari are.
Yeah, they're really the worst of the worst of a nasty society that didn't care about anything.
Yes, the truest form that elves can take.
Wow. Good job. So, yeah, I mean, I do think that there is something to be said about just embracing being the bad guy. 40K is, grimdark and everybody's kind of a bad guy, but there's no sugarcoating on Drukhari. So that's kind of the background on that. But what's it like for their actual faction?
It actually manifests well into their faction with that background, as they discovered that they could elongate their lives to avoid the inevitable torture of Slaanesh when you eventually perish as an Eldar.
Right, because when you die, she takes your soul or something like that.
Yes, and with the Eldari, they try to protect themselves in soul stones and basically get uploaded into a computer to hope to live that way eternally.
Fair enough.
The Drukhari found out that by being Slaaneshi in nature, you can delay death. Basically, get eternal life through doing unto others so that it doesn't get done onto you.
Okay.
So this warped Drukhari society a bit more. So first you have the Kabalite portion of the faction, which is like the main military force that goes out raiding, getting people, and bringing them back for the other two portions here. The next part being the Wych Cults, which are essentially doing a celebration circus of violence and all that.
Just kind of like the worst examples of the old Colosseums.
Yes, the torturing playing with your food.
Yeah.
Doing that to feed the citizens the fear and torture of your prey so that they can continue elongating their lives. And then you have the Homunculi Covens, which is like your dark scientists attempting to get you immortality through basically doing horrendous things to any living creature and machinery to see what can cause more pain to others, elongate your lives.
They're like the crazy scientists, but their goal is torture, essentially.
Well, their long-term goal is essentially immortality through like cloning you and stuff like that for Drukhari, and then getting the most out of the torturing of your prey so that you can elongate your lives through that angle as well. And there's a lot more depth to all of these. I'm trying to give like a 3-second example of what they represent.
Right.
There is some really fun, interesting Drukhari stuff, but this is a basic understanding that you need going in.
Right. This is kind of why the faction has the rules and units and that type of stuff that we'll talk about at some point in the future here. But I would like to hear why somebody would not want to collect Drukhari from somebody who enjoyed doing it quite a bit. Like, what are the potential problems there?
So gameplay wise, Drukhari are very much trade focused, finessey. They are very not tanky, except for in Covens you have the tanky portion of the army, but for the majority of your army you are very frail. You do a lot of damage and then die instantly if damage is done unto you.
Right. Not too many like core stand on the objectives. I'm a custody. More of a we'll run up, kill the custody, and then die.
Exactly.
Cool.
So for some people that might not be a playstyle they enjoy, is what I would call a fiddly bits army.
Okay.
It is a bunch of tiny, frail figurines. They're not big, chunky spacemen. So from a hobbying standpoint, they're kind of a pain in the ass compared to something big and bulky.
I see what you're saying.
Drukhari, Admech, Necrons, the spindly boys.
Yeah, the things that are annoying and easily breakable.
Yeah, you're going to super glue your stuff a lot. It's less common with Drukhari than the other two, but all three of those suffer terribly from this.
Okay.
There's minor annoyances throughout. Another thing is, it's an army that really wants you to get into things like 3D printing and stuff, at least right now. There are some very old, terrible models in this faction. There are some solid third of the army is probably fine cast or ancient.
Yeah, and I can see if you don't really want to do 3D printing or a lot of kit bashing and stuff like that, but you also still want your models to look good and cool and modern, that could be a problem, yeah.
If the idea of hobbying extra than just buy a box off the shelf, assemble it, and paint it, if anything beyond that sounds awful to you, that would be a knock against Drukhari.
Okay. So one of the things about Drukhari that you kind of brought up was there's 3 distinct sections of the army. So there's the Cabal, the Witches, and the Coven.
Yeah, 3 prongs to the trident or 3 talons to the army, however you want to say it.
If somebody looks at it and goes, I like one of them, but the other 2 don't really interest me, is that a problem?
Currently in 9th, slightly.
Okay.
I can't tell you with 10th. We're recording this next Monday will be the show-off article for Drukhari. We'll see what it looks like.
Yeah, we don't know about these things. But from 9th and just the kind of expectation, I know that I haven't seen too often where it's just like you just have 1/3 of it complete and focused on it type thing.
Yeah, I think if you only like 1/3 of Drukhari, it's probably not a good idea.
Okay.
I like 2/3 of Drukhari. I have all 3, but I have less of the Wych Cults than I do anything else, and I play them less, and I'm perfectly content.
Okay.
But liking all 3 is the ideal. I'd recommend liking at least 2 out of 3 of them.
Yeah, I think One of the nice things about Drukhari is that like all three of them actually play pretty well together, even though they are unique and distinct. So if you do like all three or even just two, like they mesh together well.
All right, so let's get into the discussion proper of like my journey collecting Drukhari and things I would advise.
Okay, so you had said that, you enjoy 2/3 of it basically. So you've decided to start collecting because you like some of it. Where'd you start?
I actually started with a Christmas present. We were trying to get everybody into their second army for a Christmas, and we all just bought pieces for everybody else's army, and then thus you receive a good chunk of an army.
Yeah, since there's a full play group kind of thing, like if everybody gives you something, you get quite a bit actually.
So we were getting our one buddy into Space Wolves as his second. Another one was getting into Sisters. I got into Drukhari. So I just got a bunch of stuff that way and then started building from there. My favorite portion of the army is Covens, which, as we'll get to later, comes with the downside of you better be willing to 3D print or at least learn how to kit bash.
Yeah.
Wyches is the third that I don't like. And in the middle, I just enjoy the Kabalite and the Blades for Hire, I guess, technically, because Scourges technically aren't part of Kabalites, but whatever, and neither are Incubi.
Oh, right. Yeah, I guess I just assume Incubi are...
Because they look like the elite version of a Kabalite, but technically they're not.
It looks very, very much. I mean, part of it is also because I'm used to your army. So, like, the way you painted them and stuff...
It's the same no matter what. If you put them in the default paint scheme next to each other, it's like, oh, here's my troop and here's my elite unit.
Exactly, yeah.
But there is lore reasons.
Okay.
So I guess let's start off by talking about Kabalites and Blades for Hire and vehicles and all that, because I think it's the simplest one of the bunch.
I think that's fair, yeah.
So I have 3 Archons I've built. Drukhari is a fantastic kit bashing army. For simple stuff, you can just do simple head swaps. For more complicated stuff, my female Archon is actually from a Magus from Genestealer Cults, who I redid the arms and the head on and gave her a nice base. That was based off of like a Reddit post that I saw someone do a better job at the same thing on. And I was like, that's beautiful. I gotta do that.
I think it turned out pretty well.
Yeah, so the other 2 is basically just head swaps, and the one I gave an Incubi weapon to because I think it looks baller.
It does, yeah. And I think that that's one of the ones that, like, weapon swaps can actually do pretty good on this army.
Yes, there's... From an advice standpoint, anyone playing a Xenos faction, nobody knows what our weapons look like. Nobody cares.
Yeah, just make it cool.
You never have to get full WYSIWYG.
Yeah.
Over the course of this army, we'll talk about it, but like the 75 shapes of dildos that make up Eldar weaponry, no one knows what they are.
No, not really. I mean, I'm sure that there are some people, but it doesn't matter.
I technically do, but I won't care. Anyone who knows because they've experienced the pain of trying to figure it out.
Oh, so it's kind of like the orcs where it's like, yeah, it doesn't matter, man.
It's roughly shaped like it's going to cave your head in. It's a choppa.
Yeah, exactly. But there's some cool kit bashing stuff with Drukhari and the weapons at the very least.
I would also say your characters, as we go through like talking about my army, to talk about Drukhari as a community more, you tend to get a lot of people playing Drukhari who are very into their Sonic OC fanfic, and I say this lovingly as much as it's a joke. You get a lot of people who have very deep lore for their army. Like what makes their gang of ne'er-do-wells so special. Mine kind of developed over the course of the crusade I played, and now I actually have like titles and stuff for my different units, but it's kind of embarrassing to talk about that fact, so...
Such a nerd.
I know.
I mean, like, I'm kind of disappointed that you don't do what One Last Blade does and, like, give it each unit, like, their nameplate type thing.
I debated 3D printing those for us. When we were doing Crusade more early in the edition.
You should.
And I had my whole Coven of the Hanged Man, and I was doing all that stuff.
Yeah.
I was going to actually do bases and stuff, but the problem is Drukhari suffer from tiny bases.
Yeah.
So when your homunculus is on a 25 mil base, it's real awkward to get a nameplate.
Yeah. You can only have the names have to be 3 characters at max.
Yeah, that is a small irritation too, is the tiny base syndrome that a bunch of Xenos have because they want them to look smaller, I guess. I don't know. But it's very annoying that basically 90% of Eldar models have their feet falling off each edge of their base. All right, but back into the Kabalite portion here. I also have a Drazhar who is just, it's Drazhar. I didn't do anything special to him.
That's fair.
And then we can get into the Kabalites proper. I've got a lot of them. I'm not going to count them.
You do have quite a bit.
It took 2 full turntables to get shots for all of them.
It's in excess of 40.
The vast majority are just their normal guns, right? So splinter rifles is the standard weapon. Technically, I think some of them are splinter carbines if you were to like super look into it, because I think technically they're spare carbines in certain kits that I used, but whatever.
Sure. Can't say.
You cannot tell because there's like 45 variations of the splinter rifle anyway. But when you're doing Kabalites, you'll find some of mine, if you're watching this on YouTube, look like they're in a slightly strange pose, or like, wow, how'd you get legs that looked like that? That's because those are off of a raider.
I was like, that's because those were in a transport.
Yes, they were. Wyches is the same deal when we get there. Some of those are off of a Venom.
I mean, it makes sense. And it's another point of like, yeah, kit bashing is actually pretty nice.
Yeah, even the basics. It's a great army for learning that type of stuff. Like, I learned most of my hobbying playing this faction. You can get a lot of extra bodies off your Raider kits because you're not going to put them on there unless you're like one of the few people who likes having them on there. I kind of despise it. We'll get into that when we talk about the actual transports in a minute.
Yeah, so how about the elite ones, technically Blaze for Hire?
Before we move on, the rest I have as special weapons guys. So there's a few of them that are just the HQ where they either have their back fin to identify them as a sergeant, or the other half I gave the 2 back fins that is a grenade launcher that is like blowpipes or something off the back. Welcome to Eldar models. We're a bit confusing on how things work. The pair of smokestacks you see on the back of some of my sergeants, that's the grenade launcher.
Is it really? I just thought they were like, oh, this is, like that was your designation for this is the sergeant.
No, that's an actual grenade launcher on his back.
That's dumb.
Yeah, and the ones without grenade launchers have back fins, technically, if we're going WYSIWYG on everything. But I just tell you what things have.
Right. Because I don't give a shit. It all looks the same.
You're an Imperium player. You're just going to zone out and go, yeah, whatever. Just tell me when to roll the save.
Exactly.
But then for the rest of my heavy weapons, it's a mix of basically everything. One thing that keen-eyed Drukhari players in the audience might notice is there's usually more need for blasters than dark lances, just because you can take 2-to-1 ratio in 9th edition. So one thing I did is I learned that a blaster is just a dark lance without the lance portion. So there's a lot of them that are just, why does that blaster look funny? And it's just, I took a dark lance and snipped off the entire barrel. I turned a sniper rifle into a sawed-off sniper rifle.
Brilliant.
It can't go wrong.
Nah, I'm sure that's perfectly normal. But also, I mean, that's one that you did it for 9th expectation on how the army kit's out, but
yeah, and if I get burned on 10th, I get burned on 10th. That's every edition always changes. You just have to at some point glue the damn things on the model.
Yeah, I think that is one of the questions there of, is it worth going through and magging Kabalite Warriors?
No. Here's the main reason. You get so many spare bodies by not putting them on your raiders.
Yeah.
That you can just use all your spare guns in your kit.
Okay.
And like, you can end up with anything you could possibly need, as long as you have enough of that weapon in the first place from your Kabalite kits.
Right.
So don't go out of your way to magnetize Kabalites. It's not worth your sanity.
Okay.
It's not worth your sanity to magnetize basically any troop. Never do that. Your time is worth more than that, I promise. Unless maybe you're a middle schooler. But at that point, go study.
Go study. Yeah, that's what they do. Okay, moving on then to the Incubi. I mean, they're very similar, just like bigger and fancier Kabalites.
Yes, so lore-wise, since Eric's making fun of it, Incubi are essentially like the warrior monk type. They're aspect warriors, essentially. And Archons are essentially mob bosses who have like a private army of Kabalites. The Incubi will not be subservient to an Archon. They will work under contract for them, which is where they become blades for hire instead.
Okay.
So that's why, like, Drazhar and the Incubi are not part of the Kabalite portion of the army. But anyway, into my Incubi, it's a pretty basic. You put the kits together, you get spare heads luckily, which is great. I actually used one of those to make one of my Archon heads, and you don't ever have to have an unhelmeted head between any of your Kabalites, which is perfect.
I think that's one of the things that I do enjoy is that everything has a helmet, and they're not like really dumb helmets, but like everything has a helmet because fuck painting faces.
Yeah, that would be one of my things about this army. If you notice, going through this on the video version, the only faces on my units is my Succubus and my 2 Homunculi, who are like my main characters.
Yeah, and even then, one of them's like cowled, isn't it?
Yeah, he's got a cowl on, but the faces is like the thing that I feared the most going into this, coming from Necrons, where I just dry brushed everything.
Yeah, Necrons get to cheat a little bit on that one.
And I painted this army 90% contrast paints or a metal paint, right?
Yeah.
And then the last like 10% is I did some basic oil washing to learn that.
And then some highlight.
There wasn't really highlighting at all on this faction, to be honest.
Oh, really?
Through very careful usage of oil washing and keeping things as bright as possible in the first place.
Ah, okay.
So, yeah, we could talk about the painting of this army at some point, too.
But I do think that, at least for me, a positive for Drukhari and the fact that you do get all those spare helmets means that, like, you don't have to worry about painting faces, because it's a nightmare.
Except for Wyches. Wyches is unfortunately the problem there, and we'll get to that and how I solved it. So, moving on from Incubi, because there's not much to talk about, I also have 20 Scourges, because I bought like 4 boxes of them, and each one gives you one of each weapon, essentially, which is obnoxious, because you're only ever going to run them as all the same weapon. It's the old kit problem, like old Marine Devastators are this way, where they give you like one of every weapon, and you would never run it like that because that would be awful from a gameplay standpoint.
Yeah, right. Like, just because of how the models are set up, you don't actually want options.
No, you want to have 4 Dark Lances.
All of something. But yeah, it's kind of weird that they give you all those different weapons, but
It's just the old kit problem. We've moved past this. Modern kits don't tend to have this problem. But yeah, so I ended up with 4 sets of Scourges, which I guess is why old kits are this scummy way.
is there any way to kind of like cheat on that of like you get extra weapons from other things and like
You probably could for a couple of them, but like Dark Lances you could maybe do it for, but not Haywires. It'd be mixed, and you would be losing options from Kabalites, which also want them usually, because our special weapons are actually very good.
Okay, so I mean that is kind of annoying, but at the same time I don't think everybody has to go into 40 Scourges.
It's only 20, but yeah, you don't have to go into like multiple boxes of them. But the thing I'm really proud of is I really like how I did the wings here.
Yeah.
It was one of the things I was actually kind of afraid of starting out, and then as I was getting better with using contrast paints over the course of this, I started getting into like 2-brush wet blending and stuff, and like got some really nice wings on a couple of these, and I'm very proud of how they turned out.
I think you did learn a decent amount from these wings.
Yeah, the Batwing ones are terrible. I should not have contrast painted the Batwings. I should have tried something else entirely, but it's far too late, and I'm never going back to fix them because the normal like Razorwing wings are way prettier anyway.
That's true. Yeah.
Which is why everyone always steals them for kit bashing their custom HQ in any other faction when they're like, I gave my guy angel wings.
That's like, where'd you get them? Well, Scourge. Yeah. I mean, they do look good.
Yeah. And then we get into our first bit of proxying. So if we continue in Blades for Hire, we've got Mandrakes that I have. Do not buy GW's Mandrakes. They're fine cast and terrible.
Yeah. Those are the ones with like the weird robe kilt thing.
Yeah, and there's a couple solutions, all of which are AOS. So I did the less common one, which is to go to AOS and get Spite Revenants.
I mean, I'm a big fan of if you have a bad model, take a look at AOS for something, because they generally have good ones.
Yeah, but Mandrakes are like, in lore, they're like shadow people. So I went to Sylvaneth, got Spite Revenants, and painted them up more ghosty, like they're made of smoke essentially, but like spectral smoke.
Yeah, like ethereal kind of.
Another common one that I've seen way more often that I think looks great is to use Namarti from Ideneth Deepkin in AOS. That's a very common solution that I like as well, but I had this one in my head and decided to execute on it, and I love them.
Yeah, they do look pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably a good idea to do an alternate style than the actual kit until they come out with something new.
Yeah. These are also the only bases in my army that don't match the rest of my bases. And that is simply because as I was doing them, I realized when I had them on the normal base, it didn't sell the effect very well. So I went back with an airbrush and just blasted the base like colors to match them more to make them feel more ethereal and less like a blue man walking on a desert. And it worked really well. They do look much better than they did with the normal base. So yeah, so they're warping the base around them.
All right. So what do you want to move into next?
Let's just do vehicles while we're here before we get into the other two prongs.
Okay.
I've got 4 Venoms that I just didn't put dudes on, and they sure look like Venoms. Here's a tip for anyone getting into Drukhari, and this is the same for several other armies. Do you know how, like, when you're new, you're like, oh god, I don't know which weapon option to put on this vehicle?
Yeah.
On the underside of the Venom, you have to make a choice on which gun to use. Do you see which gun I put on each of these Venoms?
Yeah.
You do not, because you can't see them.
See. Okay.
So it doesn't matter. You're going to say, like, hey, the gun that's most efficient this edition, that's the one that's on all my Venoms. And they're going to say, okay.
Yeah, there's not an issue. I do think that, so I mean, we'll get into the boats next, but the Venoms feel like they're missing something without a dude on them.
But because what I do with these transports, because all of these are transports, and we're not playing the part of the edition where we play empty transports as a troll thing. I always place the sergeant of the squad that's in the transport, or if there's an HQ in the transport, I put them on the seat in the back. So being empty helps for that, because it lets you keep track of which transport has which team.
Right. I think that is nice, especially for the boats, because there's just enough room that like you can slide him in there and it's all good.
Unless it's like Drazhar, then he's kind of sitting awkwardly on top of the back end.
Yeah, a little bit.
It's just chilling.
The Venom is whatever it is, I think. But I think there's a bit more about the boats and how to do, because it's the Raider and Ravager.
So I only have 1 Ravager, and technically I did do the like 4 magnets it takes that it could be a Raider.
Okay.
Because you just have 2 on the bottom side of the turrets and then 2 on the sticky out bits under the turret that you stick them to.
Right.
That's all it takes to have a magnetized Ravager. I have a ton of basic Raiders because how I got the army was through a bunch of value boxes and stuff.
And also, like, for a bunch of the edition, that was just, you take the Raiders because as a transport, they're very efficient.
And to be honest, it's been like that for multiple editions, and it's the fact that Drukhari plays as a raiding flotilla is like a core concept of Drukhari. So it is very likely, however they go throughout the editions, it will be a fluke when having a load of raiders is bad.
Right.
Raiders should be, by default, taken in Drukhari, multiple of them. It's like Terminators and Grey Knights or anything like that, where it's like, this is how the faction plays lore-wise.
And that's something that's agnostic from the Coven, Cabal, Witch stuff. Everybody uses the Raider.
Yes.
So it's not one of those where you have to worry too much about like, oh, but I want to play the Cabal side. And all. It's just like, you're going to be playing Raiders. They're cool.
If you want to get more into hobbying, I have seen people dedicate their Raiders to like their specific subfaction of choice. Like they'll rack one up. The sail will be made out of skin. They'll have some like of the techno tentacles that are spare from like a Cronos kit coming from underneath, like so it's got like tentacles coming off it. I've seen people do amazing stuff with that.
I could see there being cool kit bashing on that.
So if you want to get really into it, you can go far with that type of stuff. And then I guess technically I own 1 Razorwing Jetfighter I picked up for super cheap from a secondhand shop near us.
Not sure I've ever actually seen it.
I played it in exactly 1 game this edition. It's terrible, but I wanted to play it because I had just bought it. But I will probably at some point paint it, but the paint job that was on it was competent. I might just end up basing it and saying like, we stole this shit. It's hilarious.
It doesn't really fit, but
no, it's almost exactly opposite colored from my army.
It is pretty much opposite color, yeah.
But it's competently painted, so I feel bad overwriting paint jobs of things I buy that are like well done. In Necrons, I have my lore reason that we'll get to when we do the Infinite and Divine episode of Necron law and allowing you to take from people who have wronged you, stuff like that. So
I think it's fair. Yeah, you raided and stole a
Drukhari, there's infighting literally everywhere. It's more weird if two people actually team up. So yeah, stealing someone else's ship and then riding it around in their colors to laugh at them, that seems on point. I just gotta get it based.
Fair enough.
But maybe one day I'll paint it. Let's move into Wych Cults.
Alright.
They're my least favorite, but it is where I get to show off a little bit of 3D printing and stuff.
Yeah, so the normal Wyches.
I don't own many Wyches because I just don't like this part of the army, as I've said. What you see is actually a large chunk of them are off of the Venom kit.
Mm-hmm.
And when I didn't have helmeted heads, I stole from my Scourge boxes or I 3D printed more heads. And this is literally the first thing I ever 3D printed was heads for Wyches. Failed miserably. My second one worked.
Yeah, and I do enjoy helmets, just generally. I'm sure that if you're a good painter and stuff, you can make Wyches look good with their, but...
I don't like the aesthetic of Wyches. The gladiator 1980s leather suit weirdness, it's not my jam.
Yeah.
I don't like it very much. We'll get to the exception case in a minute, but yeah, Wyches are not it for me. So my Succubus is essentially just literally the generic Succubus I painted. I did nothing. I care very little. I just wanted to have access to them so I could run all three prongs.
Yeah.
And then the one thing I did for Wyches was I made proxies for my Bloodbrides, which in this edition, all three basic troops could have like an upgrade version. And for two of those, I actually made the upgrade version out of using a different kit. I didn't bother doing it with my Incubi because I couldn't find anything I liked to show off Trueborn until Corsairs came out.
Okay.
But Corsairs kind of have rules with us, sort of. So then I didn't end up using them as Trueborn, and I just didn't end up buying any. Whatever.
Yeah. So proxying your Bloodbrides.
We go to AOS. That's what we do in this house, because they have the best kits.
That is basically what we do, yeah.
And I just used the Witch Elf kit from Daughters of Cain. Technically, I used the Sister of Slaughter heads and a couple options from there to make my special witches. The net is like entirely based off of bits that I glued together to make like a gross, horrible, hooky net that you do not want to get hit with.
Yeah, I mean, it worked out.
It looks like something that you expect Drukhari to have. Like, it's made out of bits, but it totally worked.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those that even with the proxy type thing, it fits into the aesthetic of the rest of the army.
Yeah, and if you said, like, these are witches and these are upgraded witches, your opponent would be like, I agree, they have less clothes.
Yeah, that looks right. I've played mobile games.
Exactly, this is how female armor in MMOs work. They're higher level, I can tell. There is more booba in this one.
Yeah, it's the plot.
So, moving on to my Hellions, I have some explaining to do.
Yeah.
These are not the GW Hellions.
You don't say.
Yeah, they look pretty close, to be honest. So my Hellions are actually 3D prints from Imperitum, who you can find Imperitum Art Gallery on like Cults 3D and stuff. We'll put a link in the show notes. No relation or anything to us. I enjoyed these 3D models, so I bought them.
I think that's fair. But at the same time, I mean, they are noticeably different than Hellions.
They are completely in the spirit of Hellions.
They are.
If I'm being honest, I like these ones better.
Which makes sense. I mean, if you didn't, you probably would have just bought Hellions and not 3D printed, but...
Well, about that. Hellions were out of stock for about 9 months this edition.
Okay.
So, yeah, there was very little option on 3D printing them or just not making any at all. And I very much, when I was at this point of making the army, I just wanted to have everything I had mild interest in, to have something so I could play with it and try it.
Okay.
So I bought these files off Imperitum, printed them out, and I think they just look better. They're less like spandex, gross leather stuff, which I hate.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I do think that like there could have been some more interesting weapons since you were 3D printing already.
Yeah, but these were also like, we're talking about everything I printed for Drukhari was the first month of any of us owning a 3D printer, because I was the first one to buy one.
Right. I think if you were to do it again...
I mean, at this point, I would just tell my brother what to print because he has done about 1 trillion prints.
Right.
That may be an understatement.
And yeah, just be like, here's a bunch of weapons, print them, and we'll figure out what happens then.
I would just send him files and say, bill me.
Yeah.
And I would show up at his house and there would be a bunch of models for me to glue together.
Right.
And they'd all be higher quality than these, because the print lines on some of these that I printed originally with like learning how to set settings on a cheap 3D printer, they annoy me, even though you might not be able to see them unless you're like in person looking very close like I do.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I will say this army taught me that 3D printing is way easier than people try to claim it is. Like, does it have problems? Yes, like literally everything does. I've superglued my hand to a Great Unclean One. Doing literally anything can have problems. I've had less issue with 3D printing than I have normal printing. I'll put it that way.
Normal printers are from the fucking devil. 3D printers are like just kind of complicated.
You know all those problems you have with normal printers? 3D printers have about a third of that.
And most of them are like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. I Googled the thing and here's an answer on what I can try. As opposed to printers that are normally like, I don't know, man, kick it and see if the demon inside is happy.
Yeah, the problem with normal printers tends to be it's a $5 worth of parts printer that you bought for $99 because you hate having a printer in the first place. And then you're wondering why it's constantly broken.
Yeah. But 3D printing, it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be too intimidating. And I think Drukhari is a nice army to use as a first attempt kind of thing.
I honestly have a fun idea for an episode where we go through every army and talk about like how much they need 3D printing versus how much 3D printing can help them, or if I just don't recommend bothering with 3D printing and just using official models the whole way through.
I think that could be cool.
Drukhari I consider quite high on the curve. If you're not kit bashing, you should be 3D printing about half of the range because it's either ancient or fine cast, and fine cast might as well not exist.
Yeah, I think you can do kit bashing and not have to deal with 3D printing, but I think it would be a fine army to have the option of 3D printing. And one of the nice things is like, even if you screw up a bunch on it, you can probably use those screwed up parts and just like hack it in half and like put it on one of your boats or something like that.
Yeah, I will say, so like these guys have like half heads where everything above the nose is exposed.
Yeah.
The bottom half of their faces is covered. The top half is exposed. And I was like, I'm going to print these because they're one item for the body. And I'll just cut their heads off and put helmets on them if I hate them.
Yeah.
And I painted them, and it turned out okay just doing contrast paints. And I just left them. I was shocked at how easy it was. But again, like going into this army, I was like, no exposed faces. I hate faces. I'm not going to paint a face. I don't want anything to do with this. Minimum effort, contrast paints or airbrush on everything. And like going through this army afterwards, I was like, okay, bare skin and faces was not that bad. I was very afraid for no reason because I was newer. Yeah, there were a lot of lessons I learned over the course of collecting this. Moving on, for the final thing in Wyches, I've got Reavers. I have 3 kits worth of Reavers. I bought them secondhand off eBay. They were already assembled, so I just painted them as best I could and I was done.
Yeah, I mean, there's not really anything special on them. I think there's potential for kit bashing and 3D printing.
I could have 3D printed them, but
I think the actual models are pretty good.
yeah, there's a lot of options for Drukhari in the 3D printing realm. Like, I love Edge Miniatures, which we'll get to in a minute here, and Imperitum does fine work as well, and there's a couple others that I didn't even use back then that exist now. You could definitely just literally 3D print the whole army and never touch GW plastic if you wanted to. A bit too far for my taste, but it's an option.
So let's move on to the Wracks. We're going to get into Covens.
Okay, so Covens is my babies, and it's also where I did the most custom work.
Yeah.
So starting things off, you'll notice if you're watching YouTube, neither of my homunculi are the GW homunculus. The GW homunculus looks like crap. I don't even think it's an old kit. I think it's one of the newer parts of this branch of the army. It just looks like crap. So when we were doing these armies, we were receiving our Kickstarters from Archon Studios for all that Rampart terrain we bought. And they had like some space vampire faction they were showing off from some new game they were launching. I don't know. The point is, I was like, space vampires? That's essentially Drukhari. And I was looking at them and I was like, man, I could totally just do a little bit of custom work and get these to look like homunculi. And so I took 2 of the models and did just that. So both of my Wracks are kit bashes of a combination of bits from other Drukhari kits and those base bodies to act as like the main torso section from the Archon Studios thing. I actually love how they turned out.
I think it turned out really well.
Yeah, so I've got like my main dudes that have been like my main characters in our crusades, and I enjoy how they turned out. You could go 10 different ways. You could just 3D print your own. There's great examples from different makers online. You could use the GW one if you have no taste.
I think it's fine.
It's ugly as sin. It's got that
No,
stupid long hair on one side, bald ass head on the other side. He looks like a 95-year-old trying to hide as a 20-year-old hipster. No, it's the dumbest fuck ugly face. I hate the GW homunculus.
Yeah, apparently. I didn't know you had such strong feelings on that. I just thought you liked these better.
No.
Boy, was I wrong.
I was adamant that I was going to find a solution that was not buying that.
Okay, then.
Yeah, when I get my third homunculus at some point, it will also not be GW. I don't know how I'll do it. I might just raw 3D print another one, because there's a ton of great ones online I've never used.
Yeah.
But I was in a kit bashing mood, and we had just got those bodies, and I was like, let's see what I can do with some bits. But then moving on to the Wracks. My Wracks is a pretty complicated one to talk about here. I have essentially 3 sections of Wracks. So the first one being GW Wracks, which is GW Wracks, but some of the bits I didn't use, and I used some green stuff to cover up certain backs so that could get more variety in how they all looked.
Yeah.
Some of them, I think, are based off, like, kit bashing certain legs with the, like, spare body that comes so that you can convert a Venom pilot into one. Like, there's a little bit of work that I did with my basic GW racks, but the main thing is the next 2 sets.
Yeah, because, I mean, you printed one.
Yeah, so the second set is all printed from Edge Miniatures, which is where my favorite Coven units come from 3D printing. I really like the art style Edge has, especially for Covens. It fits very well in GW. It's like the correct amount of complexity on the model in looks. Like, it's not like very barren, but it doesn't try to like overdo things, because GW has that like hard style to describe. They don't take things over serious in the scope. They like try to round things out a little bit. Do you get what I'm trying to say? Like a specific art style that sometimes you will find a nice model online and you print it and put it next to a GW mini and it looks like these don't belong in the same game.
Right. And it's not because the theme is different. It's because the actual, like, the fundamental core silhouette is like not quite right. Like, yeah,
you get too much design noise or not enough, and Edge hits that perfect spot where when you put my racks all together, you see the variety in them, but you're like, that could all have been different sculpts from the same company.
One isn't like super in depth, whereas another one is like bare bones in comparison.
Yeah, so I really like my racks that I got from Edge. I didn't print that many of them because, to be honest, I had a lot of the next thing that I'm going to talk about that I had already made. So up next is my racks that I tended to use mostly as Homunculi, which is the upgrade.
Right.
They're also, if I'm only running racks, like they're the only thing I'm running, I use this unit because they're like my favorite thing I did.
As much as I do actually like the printed ones, and the GW standard one is...
It's okay. They're crazy short.
That is kind of the big problem. But like, because you're the one that I play and see playing these racks, Homunculi proxy, to me, this is what a Wracks is.
Which is funny because people who are aware will be like, wait a second, that's that Necromunda gang.
Yeah.
I went and got a couple boxes of the House LiQWYD gang. I 3D printed rack heads that I just found online for free because I was just trying to find rack heads.
Yeah.
I printed those off and I used spare arms from all over the place. Like, some of them are rack arms. Some of them I think are from the Wyches from AOS. Some of them are from proper Wyches. Some of them are Kabalite arms. It is just a mix of elf arms.
Which is fair.
And a couple of them are actually the LiQWYD arms mixed in there because they're the same scale.
Yeah, I was going to say, honestly, I think that there's some good Necromunda stuff as well. Like, AOS is the go-to.
Yeah.
But there's some cool Necromunda stuff, especially for kit bashing where, like, you know, you're like, oh, I also grabbed a bunch of arms. And honestly, like I said, to me, these are racks.
And it does fit aesthetically too, because like racks are like essentially the surgeon assistant guys.
Yeah.
They're not dumb. Like in lore, racks are... You sign up to become a rack. A Kabalite who like owes money to the wrong guys will like run over and be like, yo, homunculus, I'd like to train under you. Turn me into a rack so no one knows who the fuck I am. I work for you now and would like to become a homunculus one day.
Yeah.
Or they'll do it like to pay off a procedure or something. They're like, I'll become a rack, but in, 100 years, I want you to make sure I get installed as an Archon of my own Kabalite force.
Some type of deals going on there, but it's not like a punishment.
Yeah. So they're intelligent beings. So like I really like the like lab coat outfit type deal I have in my faction colors. So the Delicu gang is great for that body because I saw that and I was like, that's what I want my rack bodies to look like. So I've done racks a whole bunch of different ways now. I don't think there's a wrong answer. Racks are awesome. I just love Covens.
A little bit biased on that one, but yeah, there's some cool stuff you can do.
Now there is a wrong answer for the next thing. Never in a million years spend money on the GW Grotesque kit. The Grotesque is a single fine cast model.
Yeah.
So there is a million 3D prints online for them. Again, I love Edge's prints for them. That's who most of my racks are. But there's also a bunch of options for kit bashing using other GW kits.
Yeah.
My first squad will show off are my kit bashed ones, and they are Vargeist bodies that I then added on bits from the Cronos and Talos box, which is like the best box in Drukhari for bits. You get so many spare bits in that box that we'll be talking about them again when I get to my Cronos and Talos.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the kit bash, it works better than the GW one, but I think the printed that we're going to show and talk about next fit more to what I would expect out of the like theme of GW.
Yeah, I could see that because the kit bash is making the best of what GW offers.
Yeah.
From a printed standpoint, you're not like limited to finding kits from this company that match.
Right. This one is just like, if it was to be redone with the same fundamental concepts, this is what it could be. And I think it does a good job of that, specifically the one that you ended up choosing. But I'm sure that there's a bunch out there.
I will say my grotesque weapons are where I noticed the print lines from these early prints the worst.
Yeah.
They're horrendous, especially after doing a metal coat and washing them and stuff. It bothers me to no end, and I have threatened multiple times to chop their hands off and go get new ones printed, but I have not done it because they are finished and I need to stop touching things.
Yeah, and I mean, at the same time, like, you could probably just print the whole thing over again. Just have extras. Is that a big deal?
And I will say, as we go through the grotesques that I have, you will notice they all tend to have weirdly different skin colors as I was trying different ideas for what I wanted. I wanted skin to look different for my paint engines, my grotesques, my Talos, my Cronos, anything like that. And like, I couldn't figure out how I wanted the skin to look. If I wanted it to be like blue dead flesh, or if I wanted it to be normal skin but like raw, or if I wanted like dead skin where it's like skin but instead of fading to like a redder tone, you're going for like a purple grosser tone.
Yeah.
The one I ended up liking the most is what's on my Talos and Cronos because I painted them dead last, but it's not worth repainting the skin colors on all of my experimental grotesque skins because it's kind of the point that they're all weird.
Yeah, I think that works okay for them.
Like lore standpoint, grotesques and the paint engines like Talos and Cronos tend to be old opponents that you torture into this stuff. That could have been a Space Marine. The other one could have at one point been a Tau.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a huge problem for the different skin tones. Like, it still fits in with the rest of the army just because they are supposed to be different.
Yeah, and it's why you don't see them matching basically anything else in my Eldar stuff.
Right.
It's just what I was going with when I was trying experimenting. I will say on the kit bash ones, one model has perfect complex skin that looks like I spent a week doing it.
Yeah.
It was completely on accident. It was a salvage job because what was originally on it was terrible, and it took me like 5 different attempts to get it like back to normal without having to go reprime it and just do it again. I have no idea how I did it in the end.
It was just a bunch of like, oh no, but this looks awful.
What do I have on a palette to salvage this? Because this looks like ass. And it's like halfway dried.
Yeah.
I'd come back later. I was like, this still looks kind of mediocre. Let's try dry brushing a flesh color over that. And like, I ended up looking at it in the end. I'm like, this is the best thing I have painted skin-wise. And I don't know what the fuck I did.
It is surprisingly, like, it stands out compared to the other ones.
It sits next to its buddies in the squad, and you're like, why is the one, like, perfectly painted and the others look like you painted it?
It does look like you painted, like, all the rest of your grotesques, got into the Talos and Cronos and learned a bunch and used that, and then came back and did this last grotesque.
Yeah, that's what it looks like, but in reality, it was just, I salvaged it into a masterpiece, and then I'm like, fuck, I have no idea how to make this skin tone.
There is no way I can reproduce this.
It has this wonderful feel of like the lower areas feel like the skin is thinner there.
Yeah.
It's hard to describe without like in person spinning the model around and being like, wow, that's a good slightly translucent skin over flesh. Works so well. And then you look at the rest of my stuff and it's just amateur hour.
It kind of is, especially the Kit Bash ones, because it's like all of them next to each other and they're like the same kind of model and they're the same like kind of skin tone, but it's clearly
one is way better.
Yeah. But Talos or Cronos, whichever one you want to talk about next.
Let's do Talos first, because Cronos, I have a Kit Bash pair that I want to talk about dead last.
Okay.
So my Talos are Talos. All of the limbs can be popped off. You don't have to magnetize, just don't glue.
I know that you don't mag them, but should they have been?
Nope. You literally just, it's sockets. It's like a easy to build kit where you just pop it on and off a pin.
Yeah.
And if they ever broke, then I would just finally glue one of the options on and be like done with it.
That's fair.
But yeah, the limbs I threw on here are just random limbs. I've got enough to build any of them any way I want because I have so many of these because of the Cronos. And like, I used a bunch of more spare limbs to do other stuff.
Right.
These kits are fucking amazing for bits. You get so many good bits out of these. So then into the Cronos. My first 4 are just generic Cronos. I'm pretty happy with how they look. I finally got the skin tone right. I was very happy with that. I probably should go back and highlight their carapace a bit more after I got the base coat down, but screw you. It's been a long process of painting these things.
They look good, and I think the same thing with the Talos.
I was debating doing a bunch of like wear and tear on all the carapace stuff and like try to make them look grittier, but then they're going to look war torn, but no other vehicle in the faction will.
Yeah, it's like it's going to be next to a boat and you're going to be like, well, what the hell happened to those things?
And then it's like, do I go back and redo wear and tear on every vehicle in the army and all the Talos and Cronos? And then I'm like, Brad, you have 3 other armies that need to be painted still and 1 army that isn't even assembled. Get back to work and stop looking at improving this shit.
It's good enough. And it is good enough. But you do have a bit of an interesting Cronos.
Yes, so my last 2 are my favorite ones. These are my kit bashed ones. I based the original design off of a random Reddit post I saw and I will never find to give credit to, but someone had a Talos or a Cronos or something that was based off the exact same base body, which is the Plague Drone body. The wings are my spare Vargeist wings from the Vargeist kit from my kit bashes.
That's what they are. I couldn't place the wings, but I was like, it's AOS. I know that.
So I've got a shitload of those wings sitting in a box right now, and I just used 2 pairs to give these guys those wings.
Yeah.
You get a billion spare tentacles, as we've talked about, from Talos and Cronos kits, so I was able to put those on there. Gave them their spare Cronos butt circles. Gave them spare Cronos back slicey Medus. Very technical terms.
Wow. The like sword holder things.
Yes. The things that are just there to make them look spooky. Which is probably the in-lore reason, to be honest.
Probably. What makes them look more spooky and scary? I don't know. Just put weapons on them. How should we do that? I don't know. Just put like a weapons rack on their back. It'll be fine.
Yeah, but I've got one picture of them while they were before priming them. Well, you can see the green stuff still in where I assembled everything. I think these are my favorite kit bash I did because they're very identifiably a Cronos, but like a different twist on it. And if you had infinite dollars, you could just kit bash up an army where all your Cronos are like this cool kit bash design.
It is interesting to me because I see this Cronos kit bash and I think, yeah, it makes sense. It is a different take, but I would be interested to see what else you're going to do with like do that same type of take on the Talos.
Yeah, and then you want to have that energy the whole way through the army.
Yeah, and then like, oh, what are you going to do with the Grotesque?
And that's where it peters out for me, where I'm like, I care more about getting armies assembled so I can play them than I care about being artistically fulfilled or anything. So this is as much energy as I normally can get mustered for an army for custom stuff, and I am thrilled with how they came out.
Yeah, I think it worked out pretty well. So I think that's all of your models, but it's not all of the models.
True. There are certain things in Drukhari I never made. I don't have Lilith She has a new model that was basically impossible to find for the first half of the edition. I figure with a named character like that, if I don't get the official model and I 3D print one, it could have just been any other succubus. So like, I didn't bother either way. I was like, I'll pick one up if I ever want one. I don't care about Wych Cults anyway.
I think the one that I am actually disappointed in is you don't have a Court of the Archon.
So, okay, here's my lecture. Ready?
And like, I get it. I get why, but go into it.
Urian Rakarth is the named homunculus. He's a fine cast kit. Somehow looks worse than the GW homunculus. Never buy one.
You and your thing with those homunculus, man.
I don't have a Beastmaster or Beast. They're all fine cast. They're technically not even in print anymore. They only like weave in and out of buyable on the GW site.
Yeah.
Like they're not on the site right now.
Right. They're not even just like, oh, it's like you can't find it.
No, they'll print them again like for 2 months and then disappear again. So like, don't buy those. Go print one if you're going to use them, but I didn't bother. The Court of the Archon is a bunch of fine cast models, and I think technically like the Urgul, there's a plastic version from a board game or something you could have picked up or some crap. But Court of the Archon I would 3D print if I was going to do them. I really like the Slith, but I hate the rest of the Court of the Archon, so I've just skipped over that.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I understand why you don't have a Court of the Archon, but I think that there's some cool potential in those. I definitely look into 3D printing anything Court of the Archon related. And I don't even know about like kit bashing for that one, just because like
they're so unique. That's why it's so hard.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are ways that you could be like, oh, I'm going to grab a bunch of AOS stuff and I'm going to grab a bunch of, whatever from some other games.
But since they're so unique, you're going to have to buy one kit for each of them. You're going to be at like $200+ to kit bash them.
At which point, yeah, you should probably just 3D print it and get like...
I don't have a webway gate, which was shit until the Eldari Codex, and I'm not buying terrain for this army. I never bought a Reaper or a Tantalus. I'm pretty glad I didn't buy a Reaper because they just announced that it's dead as dicks. The Tantalus is still a thing, and I do think the Tantalus is cool, but I will never buy Forge World again in my life.
The thing is with the Tantalus is like, it's just a bigger boat.
It is just a bigger boat. If they had a plastic Tantalus, I would probably own one. It's not worth 3D printing because it's gigantic and you just end up with a gigantic boat.
If you're going to 3D print it, then like you'd want to find something that's like unique and interesting instead of just a bigger boat.
Yeah, but then it's not really a Tantalus. Yeah, I would buy a Void Raven Bomber. Technically at our LGS, there is one sitting on the shelf right now. And I was like, I want to buy it. I have no reason to buy it.
You should.
I will then be undone with my Drukhari and have to build this and paint it.
It's going to be no worse than the Razorwing Jetfighter.
True, and I would just paint them both at that point at the same time.
And you just make them both the same.
But to be honest, I'll hold off. I have other things to focus on. I can't get distracted by going back to Drukhari again.
Yeah, I don't know, man.
And the only thing that I really regret not owning is kind of weird. The Corsairs came out in Kill Team recently.
Those Kill Team Corsairs are so good looking.
I would use them as like Trueborn Drukhari originally, which is funny because now Kabalites have their upgrade sprue thing from Kill Team.
Yeah.
But that was my original intent with the Corsairs. Then they have like pseudo rules, and I'm just waiting to see how things shake out in 10th with Eldar. Because like if Corsairs are just takeable in Drukhari and are just another Blade for Hire type thing, which is what they would be lore-wise, then I'll probably just buy 2 or 3 kits and start using them like I do with, Scourges or whatever else.
Right, and then it would be weird to have kit bashed them into something else.
Yeah, and since Corsairs are like the pirates who live with Drukhari, I can also experiment with trying a different thing so they don't match my Kabalites, because it wouldn't make much sense for them to have like the same uniform as my Kabalites.
Right.
So I can try like an alternate paint scheme I didn't end up going with that I kind of like wanted to try out, make that my thing for them. So that's just a general thing. Because like when I tested my army out, I was trying like 4 different paint schemes to pick between. I of course chose the most difficult one that I regret greatly. White is a terrible color for a faction. Don't do it to yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense, honestly. But is there any like final thoughts on your expedition into collecting Drukhari?
I'd say this army was like relatively straightforward, though it was also me learning about half the things I've used on armies since then. Like this is where I learned how to do 3D printing, which we use literally all the time. From everything after my Drukhari, basically every army anyone has had in our play group, something is 3D printed, whether it's just some bits or a unit that's like an old shitty fine cast, or flat out like, hey, I hate how this looks, I'm going to find a 3D print and have Brad's brother print it.
Yeah. It is nice to find somebody who enjoys doing 3D printing and is good at it that you can just be like,
True. I didn't hate it. My problem was with how my house is set up. The best place to do 3D printing was actually in my guest bathroom, whereas my brother's entire basement can be dedicated to hobby space. So we just have him set it up permanently down there without like stealing a bathroom.
yeah, like it's not difficult to do on your own type of thing. It's just, it is kind of nice to have somebody who enjoys doing it that you can just be like, hey, here's a model.
He won't get yelled at by his wife to put it away because we've got guests coming over this weekend.
Brad, put your toys away.
So yeah, kit bashing was a huge one for me, honestly. My Necrons were basically just slapping together and I was done. Whereas with my Cronos in this army, my Grotesques, even just doing like the basic stuff on troops, it taught me a lot of little things about putting models together. A little bit of Vallejo model putty or green stuff for the more heavy duty stuff, and some super glue can really get a job done. There was a lot of things I learned over the course of this army that I think are great skills. I think it's a wonderful army from a hobby standpoint to collect, just for the amount of stuff you can be exposed to for the first time that you may have been gun shy on originally. I tried out contrast paints for the first time, fell in love with using those, actually got good at them by the end. I learned the basics of oil washing on this army from when I did that on all of my whites. There was just a lot of little stuff I learned over the course of this army that I loved, and I think it's hard for me to like just blindly recommend it to someone. It calls to you, like you look at it and you go, this is my faction.
Yeah, I think it's a very unique and obviously different than anything else that you would get into. And, you know, even the 3 sections are like, yeah, these are the ones that you want to get into.
Yeah, and that's what I would say is you get a lot of variety out of it. While I don't like witches, as I've mentioned, I love using them as a palate cleanser. I use them because they're so very different from playing Covens.
Yeah.
But like being able to swap between very different play styles within one army is a great aspect to me. It's one of the things I like with your orcs.
Yeah.
Any army with a lot of like 3-dimensional play increases the longevity and the chances you'll love your army 5 years from now.
Yeah, and it helps that you have more options to continue exploring, especially if like this was your first, then you get more options to learn what you enjoy more.
Yeah.
And what you would use more as a palate cleanser every once in a while.
Yeah, if I could say one thing for feedback on this, it's I don't really know what I'm doing with this series idea. I don't know if you guys like this, if you'd rather we take it from a different approach. This was kind of more for me to talk about one of my armies that I very much enjoyed collecting, and hopefully get some advice to people who are like newer to collecting armies. That's not just like a top 5 tips type deal.
Kind of just like a story time with hopefully a bit of interesting knowledge sprinkled.
Yeah, and feedback in general, if you're a Drukhari player yourself and you have great advice, go for it. I'm always for other people sharing their stories of like, hey, I did this kit bash. It's amazing. You guys should try it out. It's so fun. It's a great way to make use of all your different Talos bits. It's always the Talos Cronos bits. It always is.
Always those, yeah.
Or like, hey, here's how you can put together a bunch of kits to make your own plastic version of a Tantalus. I'd love to hear that one.
I'm sure somebody's done it.
I'm sure someone has. So yeah, any feedback is welcome on this episode. We'd really like to hear what we should do for future iterations. I would like to try doing this for like several of our armies that we've collected over the years. Like even in our playgroup, we can do basically every army in the game eventually, just because our playgroup tends to play everything. But yeah, I guess before we get out of here, one final word of warning. Next week is the Infinite and the Divine Book Club episode. So if you haven't read it yet, now you have to.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be an episode with the expectation that you've read it and don't have issues with spoilers.
But look forward to that and whatever we do after. I guess on that note, let's get out of here.
Sounds good.